How's everyone who's watching this? This is my 19th video on the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the 7th chapter of Bruce Fink's book, The Lacanian Subject, titled Object A, Cause of Desire. Last time, we looked at what Lacan means when he talks about metaphors, and his conception of the subject as being composed of two sides, the subject as breach, and the subject as precipitate. This chapter is composed of 4 subchapters. Firstly, object relations, followed by lost objects, and the Freudian thing. Then, finally but not at all leastly, surplus value, surplus jouissance. Beginning of this chapter, Fink offers something of a disclaimer. Lacan saw his notion of objet petit as one of his greatest contributions to psychoanalytic theory, and as such, it is one of his most elaborate ones, encompassing too vast an area for Fink to really examine it in detail. Instead, his focus here is only on what he views as its most salient features. He makes no promises of a comprehensive account of the concept. Fink moves now to a quick overview of how he has previously used the term. To start off with, in chapter 3, objet petit referred to the residue of symbolization. In other words, the residue left over after pulling the real into language, or the symbolic. Secondly, in chapter 5, the object took the form of a remainder of a hypothetical mother-child unity that the subject clings to in fantasy as a way to attempt to find wholeness or jouissance, a form of pleasure that is overwhelming to the degree that it's painful. Finally, concerning chapter 6, he says,
I briefly mentioned object A in the context of Freud's lost object, as the subject's being, and as a product of the dialectization of a master signifier.
What this is referring to is the fact that objet petit is a lost product of giving meaning to master signifiers that close off associations for the analysand. Ending the section, his purpose with this chapter is to try and reconcile all these different elements, although he warned that, due to the term's long history, spanning almost half a century, and Lacan's tendency to constantly tinker with its concepts, it isn't always possible to do so. This takes us to the first subchapter, titled Object Relations, further divided into a few sub-subchapters, beginning with imaginary objects, imaginary relations. Fink starts by saying,
The foremost imaginary object is the ego. It is an imaginary product, a crystallization or sedimentation of images of an individual's own body and of self-images reflected back to him or her.
To give some context, what Fink means by imaginary here is the imaginary order, the realm of images in its tripartite division of the symbolic, essentially language, the aforementioned imaginary, and the real, the impossible to comprehend and traumatic. As stated in the quote, the ego is made up of images. It is thus imaginary. This also contributes to why Lacan says the ego is nothing more than an object, unlike Freud, who viewed it as an agent. It's simply a sedimentation, no subjectivity in sight. Playing off the ego's foreignness as something that originally comes from without, developing through outside images the child takes as his own, be they from mirrors around the house or from other people reflecting their actions, Lacan describes it as a little other, represented in his algebra with a lowercase a, other people's egos being marked with a single quotation to show the similarity between them. Turning back now to the title of the subchapter, imaginary relations don't refer to relationships that are illusory, as the name suggests. Rather, they refer to relations between different egos, where everything is played out in terms of being similar or being different. These relationships exist between individuals who see themselves as alike in certain ways. In the case of infants, as Fink says,
It is generally that child in the family, extended family, or circle of friends who bears the greatest affinity to the infant, and who also stands in a similar relation to a parental or authority figure.
He demonstrates this with this diagram, which takes us into the first subchapter of the section, titled Same Love, Different Hate. The main point here is that imaginary relations are characterized by identification of those similar to oneself and rivalry with those who are different. To the degree that someone is alike myself, I love and identify with them, feeling their emotions as my own. In Fink's words,
Insofar as I love myself, another self, like myself, is equally worthy of love.
On the flip side of this, there's a tension caused by what Lacan terms little difference. Even in the closest of relationships, like that between two identical twins, rivalry eventually sneaks in. This can be because of a numerous amount of reasons, one of the most common amongst them being that their parents prioritized the one over the other. On this point, Fink states that sibling rivalries are one of the most clear examples of ego relations involving hatred. Whilst they may not question their subordination to their parents or guardians, viewing them as necessarily different from themselves, children, even at incredibly young ages, often contest amongst themselves. As Fink says,
Children generally consider their siblings as in the same category as themselves, and cannot abide overly preferential treatment by the parents of anyone other than themselves.
These children come to resent their siblings for taking away their special position in the family. This rivalry comes to extend and include classmates, friends, and even cousins. What makes imaginary relations special is that every party can always see themselves in the other's shoes, jealousy appearing as a consequence of such comparisons. The divisions between them are only minor, hence the term little difference. This is why young children don't necessarily feel the same kind of hatred towards their parental figures as they do to their siblings, since they see the prior as something completely different to themselves. Moving on now, Fink states that the little other was only object of Lacanian psychoanalysis until the 1950s, when Lacan began developing his concept of a real object, the cause of desire, objet petit. At this time, he lost almost all interest in the little other, devoting all his time to his new notion. However, Fink argues, this isn't to say that the little other isn't pertinent to analysis. In fact,
the analyst is often taken by the analysand as a stand-in for the imaginary other. This is seen in the analysand's attempt to identify with the analyst as like the analysand.
This might occur with the analysand remarking that they have the same books on their shelves as the analyst, implying that they both share the same concerns and opinions. This is a search for identification, one that might originally lead to feelings of love, erotic transference as it's often called, although I'm not certain if Lacanians used that term. But inevitably, it falls into the jaws of rivalry, where the analysand begins seeking to differentiate themselves. Oftentimes, this culminates in what American psychoanalysis terms countertransference, where the analyst becomes caught up in the same game of comparing and contrasting as the analysand, a game focused largely on trying to find points of superiority and inferiority. They might think,
are they submissive to my wishes? Do I have any control over the situation? Do I have the upper hand? How come this person gets on my nerves and makes me feel so lousy about myself?
However, Lacan says, the analyst must always recognize these thoughts as imaginary, and thus push them aside. Concluding this subsection, Fink states,
they must not be revealed to the analysand, as that positions the analyst and the analysand at the same level. Such positioning prevents the analysand from casting the analyst in some other role.
This takes us to the other as object, symbolic relations. He starts out by describing just that, symbolic relations. Simply put, they refer to any relationship with a big other, and the object that it demands. For example, the relationship between the subject, the other represented as social conventions, and marriage or having children. Imaginary relations, as shown by this diagram, act as interference, covering up symbolic ones. The aim of analysis, then, is to essentially get rid of imaginary interests so that the subject can come face to face with the other. Throughout this process, the role of the big other is played by the analyst, who is considered as what Lacan terms the subject who is supposed to know by the analysand. They are assumed to know and understand everything, from the cause of the analysand's maladies to when symptoms appear. A problem arises when the analyst begins to feel at home in this role, however. It's a trap, which leads to the analyst becoming too confident in things that can only be uncovered through the course of analysis. Slipping into the role of a kind of master, the analyst identifying as the subject who is supposed to know, forms an imaginary relationship with the analysand, one of inferiority on the part of the latter and superiority on the part of the former. As Fink says,
explicitly acting as if one were such a subject tends to elicit imaginary relations of rivalry on the analysand's part, the worst possible relations between analyst and analysand.
Instead of viewing themselves as representative of knowledge, Fink states that they must instead take the analysand's unconscious as fulfilling that role. However, this is still complicated by the fact that the beginning of analysis almost always starts with the analysand casting the analyst into the position of the other of demand, that being
the usually parental other to whom the analysand has always addressed his or her demands for knowledge, help, nourishment, recognition, attention, affection, approval, and disapproval.
In Lacan's eyes, this all boils down to one thing: the demand for love. Unlike other psychoanalysts of his day, who saw their purpose as quote-unquote playing mother for their patients, Lacan viewed this as doing nothing more than making the analysand more dependent on the analyst. The result of this is that the analysand's desire begins to revolve around the demand of the analyst, represented by this matheme. Analysts are constantly demanding things from their analysands, be it money, scheduling, appointments, free association, etc. When they become synonymous with the parental big other, these demands are read by the analysand as signs of love. They form the basis of a so-called love object. Going all the way back to Freud now, Fink says,
when Freud speaks of object choice, it has to do with the subject's repetitive demand for the same kind of love object or the same kind of relationship with the love object.
When Lacan speaks about objects in or of desire in his earlier seminars, this is what he means. Love objects are, as the name suggests, objects toward which the subject directs their demand for love, something represented with this graphic. Turning now away from love objects, Fink discusses how Lacan originally viewed the goal of analysis to be a progressive dissipation of imaginary relations and the coming into focus of symbolic ones, something we touched upon earlier. At this stage of his development, in the 1950s, analysis essentially consisted of trying to rectify the subject's position in relation to the other, seeking to discover a Goldilocks zone between not fully giving in to the other's demand, but also not fully frustrating it. In his eyes, such an operation would result in a sort of full-fledged desire. In other words, a desire not dominated by the other. However, this position didn't last, as soon as it became apparent to him that a simple repositioning wouldn't be enough to unchain the subject's desire from the other's demand. Something else is needed, namely, the analyst's escape from the trap of being the subject who is supposed to know. As Fink says,
if the analyst does not truly relinquish or renounce the role of other by assuming some other position, the analysand remains stuck or stranded at the level of demand.
He concludes the subchapter by summarizing what we've looked at so far, saying that the analyst has to avoid two pitfalls. Firstly, to begin with, they have to stay away from identifying with their patients. Secondly, they have to keep from positioning themselves as some sort of omnipresent being that knows all. What this leaves us with is questions, in particular, the question of what position the analyst really occupies, something Fink seeks to examine in the next subchapter, titled Real Objects: Encounters with the Real. He starts out this section by proclaiming that desire, strictly speaking, has no object. In his words,
in its essence, desire is a constant search for something else, and there is no specifiable object that is capable of satisfying it. In other words, extinguishing it.
Desire isn't concerned with seeking satisfaction. Rather, its only focus is its own continuation, merely wishing to carry on desiring. The only object that's involved in desire is what Lacan terms objet petit, which acts as desire's cause or advent. Representing this, Fink supplies a schematic. It all begins with the cause, which produces desire, in turn jumping from one thing to the next. Autonomy here refers to a process of displacement, seen in the deferral of desire from one object onto another. At this point, Fink says that we have to take a step back and examine just what arouses desire in the child. It isn't the other's demand, or the other's desire for a particular thing, but rather the other's desire as desire. What elicits desire in the child, in his eyes at least, is manifested in the other's gaze as something or someone. To demonstrate what he means by this, he returns to object choice. Apart from the specific qualities the analysand relates as playing a role in the process, like a certain eye colour or hair colour, they often also recount something else that is difficult to put into words. This might be, for example,
a certain way a man has of looking at a woman may sum up for that woman everything she really wants in a man.
The same is true the other way around, although with men, the voice is usually more important than the gaze. A particular way of looking or speaking is what causes desire in them, a desire that can't be brushed off by qualities deemed valuable by the ego, like being caring, a good parent, and so on. It's this look or voice that determines what Freud termed object choice, what Fink will now refer to as the choice of companions. He uses this term to better clarify what occurs in object choice. Essentially, that look or voice is associated with somebody, an individual. That individual is then adopted by the subject as a companion, with the goal being to remain in close contact with the desire-causing thing. He represents this with a diagram, the A in brackets next to gaze and voice referring to their relationship with objet petit, being partial manifestations of it. Moving on now, the companion means little to the subject outside of that object as cause. Should they no longer be able to express it, there may well be a turnaround in their connection, where the subject moves on to situate themselves in a new desiring relationship. This should be mistaken to only apply for love. Instead, this applies to desire as a whole. More than simply just sexual, it applies to almost every relationship, such as that with friends. He ends the section by discussing how these two examples he has given, the gaze and the voice, belong to the order of the real. What this means is that they resist being symbolized, in other terms, being put into words. Additionally, this means that they aren't fungible. They can't be exchanged. Substitution requires the symbolic, making switching out objects impossible, instead requiring the subject to come back to them again and again. From this point of view, the challenge that faces psychoanalysis is how to hit the real and shake up the fantasy which surrounds the subject in its relationship to the cause. This takes us to the next subchapter, titled Lost Objects. Fink begins the section by relating what Lacan explicitly acknowledged his debt to other psychoanalysts when it came to developing the concept of objet petit, namely to call Abraham and Melanie Klein for the idea of part objects and to Donald Winnicott for his notion of transitional objects. However, when it comes to lost objects, what the section seeks to explain, his biggest influence is undoubtedly Freud. Yet,
as is so often the case, Lacan's lost object goes far beyond anything found in Freud's work. Examined in context, Freud never claims that objects are inexorably or irremediably lost.
To give some context, in Freud's essay Negation, he posits that the object is encountered at the outset by the child, not actively sought after. After their encounter, the experience of satisfaction gained from it can be reactivated or recalled in the mind of a child, recathected in psychoanalytic terms. There is no deliberate finding of the object, only a re-finding. The individual looks for the object in the external world, trying to find something that corresponds to their memory of satisfaction. This is what sets humans apart from animals, who simply act according to instinct, which is innate and instructs them on what to look for. In Fink's words,
humans, lacking such innate knowledge of what will provide satisfaction, must first encounter it through the good graces of fortune, and only then can initiate action to repeat satisfying experiences.
Although this all seems to go against Lacan's teaching, he admits that his reading of Freud is Talmudic in nature. That's to say, he attaches importance not to the text's fairly obvious meaning, but but rather to the letter of the text itself. Turning now to Lacan's understanding of the object as lost, Fink says that if the object was never found, as stated by Freud, maybe that's because it was never truly there. Its existence is phantasmic. It's only constituted as lost after the fact, the subject being unable to find it anywhere other than in dream life and fantasy. This, however, isn't the only way to conceptualize the lost object. Taking the breast as an example, during the child's first experience of satisfaction in connection to it, in other words, during nursing, it isn't constituted as an object. It only becomes one after the child attempts in vain to repeat that experience of pleasure, failing perhaps because the mother isn't there or refuses to nurse it. As he states,
"It's the absence of the breast, and thus the failure to achieve satisfaction, that leads to its constitution as an object as such, an object separate from and not controlled by the child."
After the object is constituted, a so-called primal state, where there is no division between child and breast, disappears. The result is that the first pleasure experienced by the child can never be replicated. Ending the subchapter, this is why Fink referred to objet petit in chapter 5, episode 5 of this series, as a remainder. It's the leftovers of a lost hypothetical mother-child unity. With this, we get to the penultimate section of the chapter, the Freudian thing. I'm going to skip this section, since I frankly don't trust myself to explain it accurately, but the main takeaway is that Freud's notion of das Ding is essentially an earlier version of Lacan's objet petit, and the subject's relationship to it is what differentiates hysteria, where the subject is disgusted in its relation to the lost object, and obsessional neurosis, where the subject experiences guilt and a feeling of being overwhelmed. With that out of the way, we get to surplus jouissance, surplus value, the final subchapter we're going to be looking at today. Fink's focus in this section is connecting objet petit with Marx's notion of surplus value, first done by Lacan in his Seminar 16. He begins by explaining the role of objet petit in day-to-day life.
As that which is most highly prized or valued by the subject, object A is related to the former gold standard. For the subject, it is that value they are seeking in their activities and relations.
He goes on to discuss what exactly surplus value is. Essentially, the term refers to what is often termed profit, the money that the capitalist skims off the top from the fruit of the employee's labor, to be quite Marxist about it. The employee never experiences that surplus product. They lose it.
The work process produces him or her as an alienated subject, barred S, simultaneously producing a loss, A.
The capitalist, as the other, enjoys that excess product, whilst the subject finds themselves in the unenviable situation of working for that enjoyment, sacrificing themselves for the other's jouissance. Now, this concludes the chapter on Object A, Cause of Desire, from Bruce Fink's book, The Lacanian Subject. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll be looking at Chapter 8, There's No Such Thing as a Sexual Relationship, where we'll get into Lacan's notion of sexuation. Until then, bye.